The porch radio had been playing to no one for nearly an hour when Elias Mercer noticed the shadow beneath the cedar trees. It was late October, the kind of evening that made the boards of the old porch tighten and sigh as the cold came down from the ridge. A thin rain had passed through just before dusk, leaving the yard dark and glossy, and the smell of wet cedar bark hung in the air with the faint sweetness of wood smoke from the stovepipe. On the small table beside the rocking chair, Ruth's old radio crackled through a country station out of Helena, catching pieces of a fiddle, a man's tired voice, and bursts of static whenever the wind leaned against the house. Elias had been sitting there, with both hands around a chipped blue mug, though the coffee inside had gone lukewarm. He was not really listening, not in the way people listened when they expected news or music or company. He kept the radio on because the house behind him had grown too quiet since Ruth had passed, and because the little box of wires and dust had once filled her evenings with weather reports, baseball scores, and songs she hummed while folding dish towels. Then the shadow moved. At first, Elias thought it was a branch swaying low, or maybe the barn cat from the tanner's place, slipping through the weeds again. But the shape paused at the edge of the yard with a stillness that did not belong to any house cat. It stood low and compact, shoulders tucked under a rain-dark coat, ears sharp against the pale grass. When the porch light flickered, the animal turned its face just enough for Elias to see the rounded cheeks, the short tail, and the quiet amber flash of wild eyes. A bobcat. Elias did not move. He had lived near the Bitterroot foothills long enough to know the difference between curiosity and danger, between an animal passing through and one that had come close because something had gone wrong. Bobcats did not usually stand in a man's yard listening to porch music. They crossed unseen. They watched from stone walls. They vanished before a person had time to be sure of them. This one stayed where the cedars thinned, rainwater dripping from the tips of its whiskers, one front paw held slightly above the ground. The radio gave a little pop of static. The bobcat's ears twitched. Elias felt something open quietly in his chest, not fear exactly, and not wonder either. It was the ache that came when a living thing appeared at the edge of loneliness and did not know it had been seen. He lowered his mug onto the table as slowly as if the air between them were made of glass. "Well," he whispered, though the word was hardly more than breath. The bobcat stared toward the porch, not at Elias's face, but at the radio. That was the part he would remember later. Not the rain, not the cold, not even the way the animal favored that paw, though that detail would trouble him the rest of the night. He would remember how the wild creature angled her head toward the little wooden radio, as if the cracked music had reached some hidden place in her memory. A gust moved through the yard, shaking drops from the cedar boughs. The rocking chair creaked once beneath Elias's weight. The bobcat stiffened, her body becoming a line of caution. She did not run, but she shifted back half a step, placing her lifted paw down just long enough to reveal how carefully she avoided pressure. Elias saw that and felt his own fingers tighten around the arm of the chair. He had fixed fence motors, tractor starters, well pumps, toaster cords, and radios for most of his life. Broken things had always told him where to begin if he listened properly. A bad wire hummed, a cracked belt slapped, a loose screw trembled in its hole. But a wounded wild animal gave no such permission. It did not ask. It did not explain. It only stood where it could flee if a human proved foolish. Behind him, the kitchen window glowed amber. The sink still held one plate, one spoon, one folded towel on the counter where Ruth used to leave two. On the porch rail, a row of clothespins clicked together in the wind, and Elias almost smiled because the bobcat glanced at them with deep suspicion, as if those small wooden things had insulted her personally. The radio settled into another song, softer now, a woman singing about a road home at sundown. The bobcat's ears relaxed by the smallest measure. He knew better than to call out, better than to stand, better than to reach for his phone too quickly. Out here, care had to begin with restraint, so he breathed through his nose, let the chair hold him, and watched the animal listen. For a few minutes, nothing happened, and somehow that nothing felt full. The porch light hummed above him. Rain ticked from the gutter into the metal bucket Ruth had once used for geraniums. Somewhere beyond the trees, a nightbird gave one thin call and stopped. The bobcat blinked, slow but not sleepy, her gaze moving from the radio to the steps, then to Elias's boots, then back toward the dark safety of the cedars. Elias wondered how long she had been out there before he noticed. He wondered if hunger had brought her down from the ridge, or the cold, or that injured paw. He wondered, too, why the music had held her in place when everything in her wild body should have told her to leave. There was a soft place in him that wanted to believe Ruth had something to do with it. He did not say that aloud. He was old enough to know grief could make patterns out of smoke and radio static. Still, the thought came and stayed beside him. If this quiet story found someone sitting alone tonight, they might have gently liked and subscribed, not for noise or fuss, but to keep these small animal memories alive. And perhaps, from wherever they were watching, they might have shared the name of an animal that once left a mark on their heart. The song ended. The announcer's voice came through faint and broken, promising frost by morning. At that sound, the bobcat flinched and turned sideways. Elias saw her clearly then, lean from hard days, mud dried along one shoulder, pale whiskers bent unevenly on the right side of her muzzle. Her left ear had a ragged tear near the tip. Old or new, he could not tell. She was not a creature made for pity. Even hurt, she held herself with a guarded dignity that made Elias lower his eyes for a moment, as if looking too directly would take something from her. He thought of the shed behind the house, where an old feed bowl sat under a shelf of rusted tools. He thought of the frozen chicken in the icebox, the wildlife number taped beside the phone, and the long habit of solving practical problems with quiet hands. But he did not move yet. The bobcat took one step backward. The porch board under Elias's boot gave a small, familiar groan. He lifted his foot by half an inch and set it down somewhere else, careful to avoid the broken board Ruth had always told him to fix before somebody went through it. The absurd gentleness of that act almost made him laugh. A man alone on his own porch, rearranging his feet to avoid offending a wild bobcat who had come to listen to his dead wife's radio. The animal watched him. Then, with the caution of something that had survived by trusting almost nothing, she eased herself down beneath the lowest cedar branch. Not fully resting, not safe, just lower than before. Her injured paw remained tucked close, and her ears stayed awake, turning toward every sound. But she did not leave. Elias sat with her until the coffee went cold, until the porch light drew moths that battered themselves softly against the glass, until the radio faded into a long ribbon of static and came back again. He did not know her name. He did not know if she would survive the night. He did not even know whether he would ever see her again once darkness finished gathering under the trees. All he knew was that a wounded bobcat had come out of the wild and stopped at the edge of his lonely yard. And for reasons neither of them could understand, she had stayed to listen. Before Ruth died, Elias Mercer had never thought of his house as quiet. It had been old, certainly. The siding had faded from white to a tired gray, and the porch roof sagged at the west corner where snow gathered first. In winter, the windows hummed when the north wind came down from the ridge. In summer, grasshoppers clicked in a pasture, and the cottonwood leaves behind the shed made a soft, dry applause. There had always been sound moving through the place. A kettle beginning to mutter, a drawer sticking, Ruth laughing at the radio when a caller gave the weather wrong, Elias clearing his throat as he bent over a toaster at the kitchen table. For 41 years, he had repaired things other people were ready to throw away. His little shop at the edge of Derby had smelled of solder, dust, coffee grounds, and the rubber belts from old cassette players. A hand-painted sign over the door read, "Mercer Radio and Small Repair." People brought him nearly anything with screws in it, and Elias treated each object seriously. He believed broken things told the truth if a man sat still enough to hear them. Ruth said that was why people trusted him. "You listen before you poke," she used to say. She had worked at the school library and knew children by the books they returned late. She was smaller than Elias, quicker in speech, and forever leaving paper notes where he would find them. "Remember the eggs. Call Nelson about the pump. Fix porch step before I become a widow by falling through it." That last note stayed beside the kitchen clock until Elias fixed the step, only for the board to loosen again 2 winters later. After, she was gone. He let it remain that way, for reasons he could not explain. The broken step had become one of the house's small voices. Each time it groaned, it reminded him of Ruth's footfall, her half-teasing scold, the way she had made ordinary things feel witnessed. There had been no children. They filled their years with nieces at Christmas, library children in grocery aisles, and neighbors needing repairs. When Ruth became ill, the radio moved from the kitchen shelf to the bedroom windowsill. She liked the weather reports best. Even when pain made her face pale and still, she lifted one finger when the announcer mentioned snow. Elias learned her programs by heart. Morning news at 6, old country songs after supper, Sunday gospel, soft as breath. The night she died, the radio had been playing low. For 2 days afterward, Elias could not touch it. He moved through the rooms with the careful confusion of a man trying not to disturb someone sleeping. He washed 1 cup and put away 2. Neighbors came with casseroles. His niece, Melanie, drove up from Missoula and tried to stay longer than he would allow. He thanked everyone. He was polite. He did not break. Only when the house emptied did the silence show its size. It sat in the hallway. It waited in the kitchen at dawn. It pressed against the bathroom mirror while Elias shaved. Even the refrigerator seemed embarrassed by its own humming. On the 3rd evening, he carried the radio back to the porch. He had not planned on making a ritual of it. He only needed one sound that had belonged to Ruth and did not require him to answer. He set the radio on the table beside the rocking chair, turned the dial until the station cleared, and sat under the porch light while rain moved across the pasture. The first song had been one Ruth used to hum badly on purpose. Elias almost turned it off. Instead, he rested his hand on the wooden case and stayed until the last note disappeared into static. After that, he did it most evenings. He rose at the same hour each morning, though retirement had made the clock unnecessary. He fed the stove, swept the porch, checked the mailbox, and walked the fence line with his canvas coat buttoned wrong more often than not. He still repaired things for neighbors, though he no longer charged much. A boy named Adam brought cracked headphones. Mrs. Vale brought a blender that smelled faintly of onions. But by dusk, his day always narrowed to the porch. He carried out the blue mug Ruth had bought at a church rummage sale because its tiny chip looked like Idaho. He sat in the rocking chair that complained in 3 different tones. He tuned the radio, sometimes to weather, sometimes to music, and sometimes to static, if static was all the mountains allowed. Occasionally, he told Ruth that Mrs. Vale's blender had nearly defeated him. The wild creatures learned his schedule before he knew they had. A red squirrel scolded him from the woodpile and once stuffed pine cone scales into his coat pocket. A gray fox crossed the driveway twice in September, elegant as smoke and equally unwilling to be admired. Elias watched them without asking anything of them. That was why the bobcat troubled him so deeply. She was not part of the usual evening pattern. A healthy bobcat would have kept to the ridge, where rabbits moved through brush and granite shelves held the last heat of the day. She would not have stood in the damp yard with mud on her shoulder and pain tucked into one paw. She would not have listened to human music beneath the porch light. After that first sighting, Elias lay awake longer than he admitted. The radio sat silent beside him on the nightstand, its cord coiled like a sleeping snake. Outside, frost silvered the grass. He heard the house ticking as the stove cooled, and once he thought he heard claws near the woodpile. He pictured the bobcat's torn ear, the pale whiskers, the wary intelligence in her amber eyes. He also pictured Ruth sitting upright in bed, telling him not to be foolish and not to be careless, which in her language had always meant the same thing as be kind. By morning, Elias had written 2 notes. One said, "Call wildlife office." The other said, "Fix porch step." He placed them both beside the blue mug, then stood there for a long while, listening to the empty kitchen and the mountain wind pressing softly at the glass. For the first time in many months, the silence did not feel empty. It felt as if something had entered it and was waiting to see what kind of man he would be. The next evening came in gray and wet, as if the whole ridge had been wrapped in damp wool. All afternoon, a low drizzle moved across the pasture, too soft to be called rain and too steady to ignore. It gathered on the fence wire in clear beads and darkened the stack of split fir beside the shed. The ditch below the driveway carried a thin brown thread of water, and every step Elias took left a darker print in the mud. By 4 o'clock, the clouds had lowered until the top of the ridge disappeared, and the house seemed smaller under that pressed-down sky. Elias had spent most of the day pretending to do ordinary things. He tightened the hinge on the pantry door. He wiped dust from 3 radios waiting on his kitchen table. He opened the drawer where Ruth kept rubber bands, closed it again, and forgot why he had gone there. Twice he picked up the phone to call the wildlife office, and twice he set it down, telling himself he had not seen enough yet. An injured paw in bad light, a thin shape at dusk. A bobcat might have many reasons for moving carefully. But the third time, he wrote the number on the pad beside the phone in pencil, darker than necessary. The old porch step waited beneath the door when evening came. Elias noticed it, as he had promised himself he would. He brought out his toolbox, laid a new board across 2 sawhorses, and measured it with the kind of care he usually saved for delicate wiring. The wet air smelled of cedar, sawdust, and the faint metallic tang of the coming cold. By then, the porch radio was playing. He had turned it on without thinking, setting it low near the railing where Ruth used to rest her elbow. The station faded in and out, giving pieces of weather and song. Snow above 6,000 feet, lows near freezing, a slow guitar, static, a woman laughing at something Elias could not hear. The sound seemed to travel differently in the drizzle. It did not rise or brighten. It slipped under the porch roof, crossed the yard, and settled among the woodpile and cedars like a small lantern no one could see. Elias was kneeling by the broken step when the woodpile clicked, not cracked, not settled, clicked. He stopped with the hammer in his hand. The split logs stood 6 rows high against the shed wall, their cut ends pale in the wet afternoon. Between the bottom row and the ground was a narrow black gap where leaves collected and mice sometimes hid. Elias looked there first, expecting the squirrel that had made an enemy of his coat pockets. Then a pair of ears rose behind the top row. The bobcat was there. She stood on the far side of the woodpile, with only her head and shoulders visible, the rest of her body hidden by stacked fur. Rain had darkened the fur along her spine, and burrs clung near her chest. The torn place on her left ear showed clearly now, a small, ragged notch against the gray light. Her eyes were amber, but not bright in the pretty way people like to say about animals. They were watchful, measuring, full of decisions. Elias did not lift the hammer. The bobcat's whiskers trembled once. The pale ones on her right side bent downward unevenly, as though some had been singed or broken. She drew in the porch air, opened her mouth slightly in that strange silent grimace cats made when a scent needed studying, then closed it again with an expression so severe Elias almost heard Ruth chuckle. "You look like Mrs. Vale judging a pie crust," he murmured. His voice was soft, but it was still too much. The bobcat dropped lower behind the logs. Elias bowed his head at once, ashamed of his own foolishness. He had not meant to startle her. He had spent years telling neighbors not to slap the side of a radio when patience would do. And here he was, speaking into the fragile space before a wild animal had decided whether he was dangerous. So he stayed still. Rain tapped on the porch roof. A drop ran from the brim of his cap and landed on the back of his wrist. The hammer grew cold in his hand. Behind him, the radio shifted into an old song with a fiddle line so thin it sounded as if it had traveled through 100 miles of weather to reach them. The bobcat's ears appeared again. This time she did not look at Elias first. She looked toward the radio. Her body lifted by degrees behind the logs, not smooth and easy, but careful. When she stepped around the end of the woodpile, Elias saw the trouble clearly. Her right front paw touched the ground, then lifted almost immediately. She placed it only when she had to, as if the earth had become too sharp in that one place. Mud clung to her legs. Her sides looked lean beneath the wet fur, not starving perhaps, but worn down by days that had asked too much of her. Elias felt the old repairman's instinct rise in him so strongly that it hurt. Find the break, clean the contact, replace the wire, tighten what had loosened. But this was not his workbench. This was not a radio case opened under a lamp. This was a wild creature built of muscle, memory, hunger, and fear, and every part of her said she would rather vanish than be helped too quickly. The bobcat stopped beside a round of fur that had rolled away from the pile. She sniffed it, then pressed one cheek against the wet bark. The gesture was brief, practical, and oddly intimate. She was marking the place, perhaps, or steadying herself through scent. Then she sat, not fully, but with her hind legs tucked under her and the injured paw lifted close to her chest. A warmth moved through Elias, despite the cold. Not happiness, not yet. Something smaller and more careful. The radio crackled, and the bobcat blinked. On the railing beside it, a moth clung upside down under the porch roof, safe from rain, and apparently committed to making poor choices near the warm bulb. Elias glanced at it and found himself thinking Ruth would have given it a name by now. Probably Harold. Probably with a whole history. The bobcat looked at the moth, too. Her ears angled forward with sudden sharp interest. For 1 second, pain seemed to leave her body. Her shoulders gathered, her pupils widened, and the fierce little hunter inside her rose to the surface. Then the moth fluttered behind the glass shade where she could not reach it, and the bobcat gave a small irritated twitch of her torn ear. Elias pressed his lips together. It was the first almost laugh he had felt in weeks, and because it came with worry, it nearly broke him. He lowered the hammer to the porch boards. The sound was no louder than a spoon set beside a bowl, but the bobcat turned at once. Her muscles tightened. Elias froze with one hand open, palm down, not reaching, only showing he had finished moving. For a long moment they stayed that way. An old man kneeling beside a broken step, a wounded bobcat beside the woodpile, a radio playing softly between them. Elias understood then that this was the true beginning, Not the moment he first saw her beneath the cedar trees. Seeing was easy. Staying still was harder. Admitting that the animal had come close enough for him to fail her was hardest of all. The announcer returned with the weather, his voice faint, but clear enough. Frost tonight. Chance of snow by morning. The bobcat turned her head toward the ridge. Whatever waited up there belonged to her. The dark brush, the granite ledges, the rabbit trails, the cold places a human could not enter without making noise. Elias knew that. He respected it. Still, when she rose and tested her injured paw, his heart tightened so sharply he had to look down at the porch board under his knees. The new board lay measured but uncut. The old broken step groaned softly as the wind moved through the gap beneath it. When Elias looked up again, the bobcat had gone halfway back into the cedars. She paused once, rain silvering the edges of her ears. The radio gave out a tender ribbon of guitar through the static. She listened for 3 breaths. Then she slipped into the wet trees, leaving the woodpile, the moth, the old man, and the song behind her. Elias stayed kneeling until the cold reached through his jeans. Only then did he stand, slow and stiff, and pick up the phone from the kitchen wall. This time, he called the wildlife office before he could talk himself out of it. The woman at the wildlife office did not laugh when Elias told her about the bobcat and the porch radio. That helped more than he expected. He stood in the kitchen with the phone cord looped once around his wrist, watching rainwater slide down the dark window over the sink. The room smelled of coffee, damp wool, and the pine shavings he had tracked in from the porch. Ruth's blue mug sat on the counter beside the pencil note that said, "Fix porch step," and beneath it, in smaller writing, "Call wildlife office." The second note had already been crossed once, then darkened again, as if courage required thicker lines. The woman's name was Paula Greer. She ran a small wildlife rehabilitation place south of Hamilton, and had the calm, practical voice of someone who had heard every version of worry and knew which ones mattered. "Don't try to touch her," Paula said. "I wasn't planning to." "Good. Don't corner her. Don't follow if she leaves. If she's still mobile, she may avoid a trap unless she weakens. We'll do this carefully." Elias nodded, though she could not see him. "She's favoring one front paw," he said. "Right side, I think. Thin, mud on her shoulder, torn left ear. Eating? I haven't offered anything yet." That was wise. The compliment made him feel oddly embarrassed. He looked toward the porch, where the radio sat silent under the eaves. A gust moved through the yard and shook water from the cedar branches. In the gray daylight, the place where the bobcat had stood looked empty enough to make him question himself. Paula gave him instructions slowly. A small portion of plain meat, no seasoning, not near the door, not enough to make the animal depend on him. A shallow bowl placed where she could approach without feeling trapped. He was to keep lights low, keep his distance, and call back with any change. If the paw worsened, Paula would coordinate with a ranger about setting a live trap where the bobcat already felt safe. "Helping wildlife can feel backwards," Paula said. "Most people want to move closer. Usually the kindest thing is to make yourself smaller." Elias looked down at his large, work-worn hand resting on the counter. "I can do small," he said. After he hung up, the house seemed to hold its breath with him. He thawed a piece of chicken in a pan of warm water, then cut it into small pieces with Ruth's paring knife. He did not season it. He did not speak to it, though at one point he caught himself arranging the pieces too neatly, as if a wounded bobcat might appreciate presentation. Ruth would have teased him for that. She had once told him he made sandwiches like he was rebuilding a carburetor. The thought warmed him, then hurt, then warmed him again. Outside, the drizzle thinned into mist. Elias found an old metal feed bowl in the shed, rinsed away dust and a spider web, and dried it with a rag. A mouse had left tiny prints inside the rim, and he shook his head at the boldness of all small creatures. On the way back, the red squirrel shouted from the fence post, furious about nothing Elias understood. "You're not invited," Elias told it quietly. The squirrel flicked its tail as if filing a complaint. He carried the bowl to the yard just before dusk. Paula had told him not to put it too close to the house, but the porch was the place the bobcat had chosen, and Elias knew enough about frightened things to respect chosen places. He compromised by setting the bowl near the end of the woodpile, 3 feet beyond the porch steps and clear of the wall, where the bobcat would have open ground behind her and cedar cover within reach. 3 feet felt like nothing to a person. To the bobcat, Elias suspected, it might be a border between danger and permission. He went back inside and did not turn on the porch light right away. He waited until the sky bruised purple behind the trees. Then he opened the door only wide enough to set the radio on the small table. The broken porch step gave its familiar complaint under his boot, and Elias paused, holding still out of habit now, as if the bobcat might already be listening from the dark. The radio came alive with static first, then a weather report, then music. Elias left the door open a hand's width and sat just inside the kitchen, not on the porch. The room behind him was warm from the stove, but the draft at his knees was cold enough to raise gooseflesh. He wrapped both hands around the blue mug and watched through the narrow gap. Nothing happened for a long while. The feed bowl sat in the wet grass, dull as a stone. Mist collected on the porch railing. A drip fell from the gutter into Ruth's old geranium bucket, with patient little ticks. Somewhere in the shed, something small rustled, then went still. Elias began to doubt the whole thing. Maybe she had moved on. Maybe the ridge had taken her back. Maybe an injured bobcat had no room in her life for an old man's careful bowl and soft music. He told himself that would be all right. Wild things owed him nothing. Their absence was not betrayal. Their presence was never a promise. Still, his eyes stayed on the woodpile. At last, the darkness behind the fir rounds shifted. Maribel did not step out so much as gather herself into view. Elias had not named her aloud yet, not properly, but the name had been working its way through him all afternoon. Maribel had been Ruth's middle name, one she disliked because she thought it sounded too fancy for a woman who wore garden clogs to the grocery store. Elias had always liked it. It held both music and stubbornness. The bobcat emerged low, one paw lifted, torn ear angled toward the radio. She stopped when she saw the bowl. For a full minute, she did not move. Then she circled it. Not straight in, never straight in. She moved in a half moon, sniffing the air, pausing to look toward the porch, then toward the cedars, then back at the bowl. Her short tail twitched once. She opened her mouth slightly to read the scent, showing the edge of her small teeth, then recoiled a step, as if offended by generosity itself. Elias pressed the mug lightly against his lips to hide a smile. "Fair," he whispered inside the kitchen. "I don't trust casseroles from strangers either." Maribel heard the sound, or felt it. Her head snapped toward the door. Elias lowered his eyes. He counted his own breaths. After a moment, the bobcat bent and took one piece from the bowl. She did not eat there. She carried it beneath the woodpile like a secret. A few seconds later, she returned, took another piece, and disappeared again. On the third trip, she sat beside the bowl, but faced away from the house, ears turning constantly, body ready to flee. That was when Elias understood Paula's words, "Make yourself smaller." So he did. He did not celebrate. He did not move closer. He did not let the ache in his chest become hunger for more than the animal could give. He simply sat behind the open door while the radio played low and the bobcat ate in careful silence. When the bowl was empty, Maribel sniffed it twice, then hooked one paw over the rim and dragged it 6 inches toward the cedars, as though claiming the evidence before any human could change his mind. Elias almost laughed then, softly enough that it stayed inside him. The bobcat looked toward the radio once more before she left. Not at Elias. Not yet. Just at the small wooden box humming under the porch roof, carrying a woman's old song into the cold Montana dark. And Elias, who had spent a lifetime fixing broken things with his hands, began learning how to help something he could not hold. The first hard frost came before dawn and laid itself over the yard as quietly as a held breath. By sunrise, every blade of grass shone silver. The fence rails wore a white edge, and the old pickup in the drive looked as if it had been dusted with flour. Elias stood at the kitchen window with his hands wrapped around Ruth's blue mug, watching the cold lift slowly from the pasture. The mountains beyond the cedars were pale at their shoulders, and the creek bottom lay hidden under a low ribbon of fog. The bowl was gone, not far gone, just gone from where he had placed it. Elias found it later beneath the lower branches of the nearest cedar, upside down and wedged against a root. A neat half-circle of frost had formed around it, as if the bobcat had dragged it there with the seriousness of someone rearranging furniture. He crouched stiffly, picked it up by the rim, and shook his head. "All right," he murmured. "Your bowl, then." He carried it back to the porch and rinsed it with warm water. The kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and wood stove heat. On the table, 3 small radios waited for repair, their backs removed, their wires exposed like tiny red and black vines. Elias had meant to work on Mrs. Vale's portable set first, but his eyes kept drifting toward the yard. He did not see Maribel that morning. He had not yet said the name aloud where the trees could hear it. It remained private, tucked behind his teeth. Still, it had begun to belong to her in the way some names did before permission arrived. Torn left ear, pale bent whiskers, careful right paw, suspicious eyes that seemed to judge clothespins, moths, bowls, and old men with equal severity. At noon, Paula Greer called back. Elias reported what he had seen, trying to sound factual and not attached. The paw still troubled the bobcat. She had eaten. She remained alert. She was strong enough to move away. She liked the radio, though he did not say that last part until Paula asked why he kept mentioning the porch. There was a pause on the line. "Sound can become part of a safe pattern," Paula said at last, "especially if nothing bad happens while it's present. Keep it low. Same time, same place. Don't change too much." Elias looked at the radio. Same time, same place. That was how grief had survived in his house. And now, strangely, it was how care would have to begin. By late afternoon, the frost had melted wherever the sun reached, but the shaded ground under the cedars stayed hard and pale. Elias set the bowl out again with a smaller portion, just as Paula advised. He placed it near the woodpile, not too close to the porch, not hidden, not exposed. He moved slowly and talked to no one. The red squirrel appeared on the shed roof and watched him with theatrical disapproval. "You can complain to management," Elias told it. The squirrel stamped both front feet, which Elias took as a formal letter. That small foolishness carried him through the first hour of dusk. He turned on the radio when the sky began to darken behind the ridge. Tonight the station came in clearer than usual. No long bursts of static, no drifting voices from some far-off town. Just a slow country song with a steel guitar, soft enough that it seemed to lie along the porch boards. Elias sat in the rocking chair, not inside the kitchen this time, but angled away from the bowl. He kept his boots still. He kept his hands folded around the blue mug. The broken porch step remained unfixed at the far side of the steps, because he had not wanted hammering to disturb the evening pattern, though Ruth would have called that an excuse and not been entirely wrong. The bowl waited. The yard darkened. At first, Maribel came only as a sound, a faint brush of fur against cedar, A pause. One dry leaf pressed into frost and released. Elias did not turn his head. He watched the steam fade from his coffee and listened with the same patience he once gave to stubborn radios, waiting for the hidden fault to reveal itself. Then she appeared beside the woodpile. The porch light had not yet fully warmed, and in that dim amber her coat looked both tawny and gray, marked with dark rosettes that broke her shape against the shadows. She stepped carefully, favoring the right front paw, but placing it more surely than before. Her torn left ear flicked toward Elias, then toward the radio. Her pale whiskers curved unevenly from one side of her muzzle, catching a bead of frost that glimmered for a second before falling. She did not go straight to the bowl. She never did. She circled once, sniffed a patch of grass Elias could not distinguish from any other patch, and paused beside the porch step. The broken board gave a tiny settling creak, though no one had touched it. Maribel leaned away from it at once, offended by the house itself. Elias lowered his eyes to his mug. "I know," he whispered. "She hated that sound too." Maribel did not flee. She looked at him, or close to him, long enough for Elias to feel the weight of being considered. Then she turned back to the bowl and ate 3 pieces, carrying each one a short distance before swallowing. After the 4th, she stopped and sat, not near the bowl, not under the cedars, beneath the porch steps. Elias forgot to breathe properly. She was still outside the circle of easy human reach. The lowest step and the open side of the porch left her more than one path to escape. She knew that, he suspected. Every angle of her body understood distance. Her ears kept working, catching the soft groan of trees, the far rush of the creek, the little tap of the geranium bucket under the gutter. Yet she folded herself low beneath the steps, injured paw tucked neatly against her chest, and faced the radio. The song had changed. A woman's voice came through now, warm and worn at the edges, singing about a porch light left burning and somebody taking the long road home. Elias had heard the song before. Ruth used to hum the chorus while sorting library returns, always half a note wrong and entirely pleased with herself. Maribel listened, not like a pet, not like a tame creature comforted by a master's room. She listened like a wild thing, measuring whether a sound belonged to danger, weather, memory, or nothing at all. Her eyes narrowed, her shoulders eased by one almost invisible degree. When the singer held a long note, Maribel's torn ear tipped forward, and when the radio gave a soft crackle, her whiskers jumped. Elias sat through the entire song without moving. His coffee cooled, his knee ached. A moth bumped the porch light twice and disappeared. Somewhere inside the house, the stove settled with a little iron sigh. The old man felt the ache of Ruth's absence sitting beside him, but for once it did not press its full weight into his ribs. It had company now, not comfort exactly, something quieter, a shared listening. When the last note faded, Maribel remained beneath the step. Elias looked toward her only with the corner of his eye. The name came out before he had planned it. "Maribel," he said softly. The Bobcat's head turned. For one breath, her amber eyes met his. Then she rose, silent and careful, took the final piece from the bowl, and slipped back toward the cedars, with the song still trembling in the cold air behind her. Elias did not follow. He did not call again. But after she vanished, he sat there a long while, one hand resting on Ruth's radio, knowing that the wild had not come closer because he asked. It had come closer because, for one whole song, he had not asked for anything at all. By the 2nd week of November, Elias had stopped thinking of the evenings as visits and begun thinking of them as weather. Not certain, not owed, not something a man could command, only something he prepared for. Each day had its own small work. He brought in wood before the light thinned. He checked the stove gasket. He wiped the porch table with the corner of an old towel, though rain and frost would undo the effort by morning. He set Ruth's radio beneath the eaves where no snow could reach it, checked the cord, turned the dial until the station came through, and lowered the volume until the music seemed less like a human announcement and more like another sound of the place. A creek had its voice. Cedar branches had theirs. Now the porch had one too. Maribel came and went according to rules Elias did not know. Some nights she appeared before the first song ended, slipping from behind the woodpile with her torn left ear tilted toward the porch. Some nights she waited so long that Elias's coffee turned cold, and the porch light gathered a pale halo of insects before she showed herself. Once, during a bright moon, she did not come at all. Elias found her tracks the next morning near the far fence, a neat line of rounded prints moving away from the house and back toward the ridge. That absence taught him something. He had missed her. Not in the simple way of missing a pet that belonged indoors and answered to a bull. It was more like missing a star when clouds covered the sky. The star had not promised to shine for him. Still, the night felt different without it. Paula Greer checked in twice by phone. Elias described Maribel's paw as best he could. Better, maybe. Still careful. Less lifted. No longer tucked quite so tight. Paula told him that if the Bobcat continued to move well, they would avoid trapping unless necessary. Stress could do its own harm, she reminded him. Space was medicine too. Elias wrote that down on the pad beside the phone. Space is medicine. Ruth would have liked the sound of it. She had always believed people healed at different distances. Some needed hands, some needed soup, some needed a porch light on, but no questions asked. During the day, Elias worked again at the kitchen table. Radios came to him the way they always had. Mrs. Vale's portable set with the cracked antenna. Adam's grandfather's weather radio, which made a low buzzing noise like an angry bee. A red tabletop model from the church basement that only played when tilted on its left side. Elias lined them up near the window, opened their backs, and bent over them with his reading glasses low on his nose. Small sounds filled the kitchen, the click of a screwdriver, the whisper of sandpaper, the tiny snap of a wire finding its place. Outside, the wind moved dry leaves against the foundation. Sometimes, when the house was very still, Elias imagined Maribel listening from the cedars, even in daylight. He knew better. Bobcats kept their own hours, their own cover, their own secret map of rocks and brush and rabbit runs. But once he looked up from a broken dial and found a perfect muddy paw print on the lowest porch board. Not inside, not even near the door. Just there. On the board Ruth had once threatened to paint red so Elias would finally fix it. He stood looking at that print for a long time. Then he did a foolish thing. He left it. For 3 days, he stepped around it as carefully as if it were a photograph. When Mrs. Vale came to drop off another radio and noticed him making an awkward half-hop over the porch step, she narrowed her eyes. "Your knee worse?" "No." "Then why are you walking like a man avoiding a tax collector?" Elias glanced at the paw print. Mrs. Vale followed his eyes, saw it, and softened before she had time to hide it. "Well," she said, "that's not yours." "No," Elias replied. She looked toward the cedars. "Might be." "Might be," she repeated, in the tone of a woman who knew when a man was protecting something small and private. She did not ask to see Maribel. She did not tell anyone, as far as Elias knew. She only left a jar of apple butter on the porch rail 2 days later, with a note that said, "For the repairman, not the cat." Elias smiled for nearly a full minute. Maribel disliked changes. He learned that quickly. When he moved the feed bowl 6 inches farther from the woodpile because the ground had grown muddy, she stood over it and stared toward the porch with such grave disappointment that Elias felt judged by every wild ancestor she had ever had. When he tried a different bowl, a white enamel one Ruth had used for berries, Maribel sniffed it once and walked away. The next morning, he found the bowl turned upside down in the grass. "All right," he told the empty yard. "Metal bowl, I heard you." That evening, she returned and ate as if the matter had been settled through proper negotiation. She also had a habit of testing objects with one paw, not batting like a kitten, not playing the way a house cat might. It was sharper than that, practical and suspicious. A fallen pine cone, the empty bowl, a curled brown leaf caught on the porch step. She touched each thing once, withdrew, watched for betrayal, then decided whether it deserved further attention. One night, the radio cord moved in the wind. Maribel crouched so suddenly that Elias's heart jumped. Her shoulders lowered, her eyes fixed on the black curve of cord with a hunter's full concentration. When the cord swung again, she extended one paw and pinned it to the porch board. The music stopped. Inside the radio, the loose plug gave up with a soft click. Elias sat frozen for half a second. Then, very slowly, he leaned forward and looked at the bobcat beneath the steps. Maribel looked back at him, paw still on the cord, as if she had killed the troublesome snake and expected no praise for it. Elias covered his mouth with one hand. He did not laugh loudly. That would have broken the evening apart. But his shoulders shook once, and the warmth of it startled him. It had been months since humor had arrived without permission and sat down beside him. He waited until Maribel stepped away before fixing the cord. The music returned in a soft burst of guitar. Her torn ear flicked. She settled again, dignified and watchful, pretending nothing unusual had happened. Night by night, their routine deepened without becoming ownership. Elias never reached for her. Maribel never crossed the threshold. She accepted the bowl, the porch light, the music, and the old man's stillness, but she kept the dark behind her. Sometimes she sat beneath the steps, sometimes beside the woodpile, sometimes halfway under the cedar branches, only her eyes catching the light. And Elias began to understand that trust was not always a bridge. Sometimes it was only two creatures resting on opposite sides of a quiet space, listening to the same song, each free to leave, each choosing for one more minute to stay. There were evenings in late November when the whole world seemed to draw close around the porch. The mountains turned blue before dark. The pasture lost its color. Frost gathered early in the low places, and the cedars held the last light in their upper branches like a secret they would not share. Elias came to love that hour more than he expected, the small hour between work and night, when the stove had been fed, the dishes rinsed, and the radio warmed slowly beneath the porch eaves. He still told himself he was only keeping a routine. He placed the metal bowl near the woodpile, never full enough to make a life out of, only enough to help a wounded hunter through a hard season. He checked the porch cord. He wiped moisture from the radio's wooden case with a flannel rag. He carried out Ruth's blue mug and sat in the rocking chair with his left boot angled away from the broken step, because the board still complained when the cold settled into it. But there was another truth now. He looked forward to dusk. The admission embarrassed him at first. It seemed too much to place hope on a wild animal who owed him nothing and might never come back. Elias had never been a man who liked depending on uncertain things. A wire either carried current or it did not. A screw either turned or stripped. A repaired radio either sang or stayed stubbornly silent. Maribel was not like that. She arrived as weather arrived, and every evening she came felt like a kindness the world had not needed to offer. On one clear night, the stars appeared before she did. Elias sat under the porch light while the radio played a soft instrumental song, mostly fiddle and low guitar. His breath made pale clouds above the mug. The wood smoke from the chimney drifted sideways and flattened against the cold. He had nearly decided she would not come when the red squirrel, who had appointed itself overseer of the entire property, gave one startled bark from the shed roof and vanished. Elias did not turn his head. A moment later, Maribel stepped from the cedar shadows. Her paw had improved. She still placed it with care, but she no longer held it against her chest every few steps. The mud had cleaned from her shoulder, and her coat had thickened into its winter fullness, tawny and gray with dark broken markings that made her disappear whenever she paused. The torn left ear remained, sharp and ragged at the tip. The pale whiskers on her right side still bent unevenly, giving her face a slightly lopsided seriousness Elias had grown unreasonably fond of. She sniffed the bowl, looked toward him, then ignored it. Instead, she walked to the porch steps and sat with her back half turned, facing the yard as though she had come to guard the radio from the entire mountain. Elias lowered his eyes to hide his smile. "All right," he murmured. "You're on duty." Maribel's ear flicked once. That became one of the gentle habits of the porch. She did not always eat first. Sometimes she inspected the bowl and left it untouched until the second song. Sometimes she sat beneath the steps and watched the tree line, her short tail curled close, her ears rotating independently at sounds Elias could not hear. Once, she stared for nearly 5 minutes at Ruth's old geranium bucket under the gutter because a drop of melting frost kept falling into it with a hollow metallic tick. When the drop finally missed, Maribel leaned forward as if disappointed in the bucket's discipline. Elias laughed under his breath. Small warmth began to return to the house in places he had not expected. Mrs. Vale's apple butter stood on the kitchen shelf, and Elias found himself putting a little on toast in the mornings instead of eating plain bread over the sink. Adam from town came by with another pair of damaged headphones and noticed the radio on the porch. "You fixing that one too?" the boy asked. "No," Elias said. "That one's working." Adam looked at the porch, then at Elias, then at the bowl near the woodpile. He was 12 and old enough to understand that questions had weight. "Oh," he said carefully. "For your visitor?" Elias gave him a look over his glasses. Adam smiled, but gently. "My mom says not to bother wild animals." "Your mom is right. Do you bother it?" "No." The boy nodded as if that answer satisfied something important. Before he left, he placed a small, smooth stone on the porch railing, a gray one with a white stripe through it. "For luck," he said. Elias told himself he would move it later. Maribel noticed the stone the very first evening it appeared. She approached it with great suspicion, stretched her neck, sniffed once, then touched it with one careful paw. When it failed to attack, she seemed to lose interest. But several nights later, Elias found the stone pushed 2 inches closer to the radio. He could not prove she had done it. He simply knew the squirrel lacked artistic intention. The radio tied all these small things together. Some nights, the station carried old country songs. Some nights there were weather reports, high school basketball scores, grain prices, and voices from towns that felt both near and far. Maribel responded to certain sounds in ways Elias began to notice. She disliked sudden laughter from advertisements and slipped back under the steps until it passed. She tilted her torn ear toward fiddle music. She ignored male announcers almost completely unless static broke under their words. But when a woman sang low and steady, Maribel often settled onto her belly with her paws tucked beneath her chest, eyes half open, still watchful, but no longer braced against every breath of the world. Elias never mistook that for tameness. Even in her quietest moments, she belonged to the dark beyond the porch. Her attention was always split between the music and the trees. Once, a rabbit moved near the fence line, and Maribel vanished so suddenly that Elias felt the air change where she had been. Another night, a distant coyote call lifted from the ridge, and she rose at once, muscles firm beneath her coat, all softness gone from her posture. She was not his. That knowledge no longer hurt the way it had at first. It steadied him. Ruth had loved birds for the same reason. She kept feeders in winter, but she never named the chickadees or claimed their return as devotion. "They come because the world is hard," she used to say, "not because we own the sky." Elias thought of that often while Maribel listened beneath the porch. One evening, snow began to fall during the last song before the late weather report. Not heavy snow, just slow, scattered flakes turning in the porch light. Elias sat with his mug cooling between his hands, while Maribel rested beside the woodpile, her spotted coat catching white flecks that melted almost at once. The radio crackled, then cleared, and a familiar melody came through, one Ruth had loved on tired days. For a moment, Elias forgot to be lonely. Not because grief had left, it had not. It sat beside him, as familiar as the chipped mug and the complaining porch step. But it had grown quieter. It no longer filled every chair. It made room for the sound of falling snow, for the absurd dignity of a bobcat judging a bowl, for the tiny gray stone on the railing, for a wild creature choosing to rest where old music lived. Maribel blinked slowly toward the radio. Then, after a pause, toward Elias. It was not affection in any simple human way. It was not gratitude, not promise, not surrender. It was only a soft closing and opening of amber eyes across a porch full of cold air and careful distance. But Elias received it as gently as he could. He did not speak. He only placed one hand on the radio's wooden case and let the song finish. By early December, the weather began speaking in warnings before anyone in town said the word storm. The mornings came brittle and pale. Ice feathered across the inside corners of the kitchen windows, and the pasture grass stayed stiff until noon. The creek beyond the lower fence no longer talked in its usual running voice. It clicked beneath forming ice, a small hard sound that made Elias pause whenever he carried wood from the shed. Even the radio seemed to know. The station crackled more often now, fading under gusts that rolled down from the ridge and pushed cold through every gap in the porch boards. The announcers spoke of falling pressure, mountain snow, livestock warnings, and a front dropping south faster than expected. Elias listened with one hand on Ruth's blue mug and the other tucked into his coat pocket. Maribel heard something different. For several evenings, she came before full dark, earlier than her habit, moving along the tree line instead of slipping straight to the woodpile. Her paw was nearly sound again, though she still placed it carefully when the ground was frozen. She did not limp so much as remember pain. Her torn left ear angled toward the ridge. Her pale whiskers trembled in the wind. Instead of settling beneath the porch steps for the songs she usually favored, she paced between the cedar roots and the far side of the woodpile, stopping often to stare uphill. At first, Elias told himself it was only weather. Wild creatures knew changes long before people did. They smelled snow beyond the ridge. They felt pressure in their bones and moved before danger had a name. He respected that old intelligence. Still, something in Maribel's pacing troubled him. She was not merely preparing. She was listening for something that pulled at her. One evening, Elias set the metal bowl in its usual place. Maribel approached, sniffed it, took one piece, and carried it not beneath the woodpile, but toward the cedars. She dropped it, looked uphill, then left it there. The red squirrel found the piece later and approached with the solemn greed of a banker collecting interest. Maribel appeared from nowhere, gave one short silent rush, and the squirrel launched itself up the shed wall so fast Elias nearly spilled his coffee. "Well," he murmured, "that meeting adjourned." The squirrel complained from the roof for 10 minutes. That should have made Elias smile longer than it did. Instead, he watched the bobcat stand at the edge of the yard with snowlight gathering along her back. Every line of her body pointed toward the dark ridge. The radio played behind him, a woman's low song she had rested through many times before. Maribel did not settle. She only lifted her nose and tasted the wind. The next day, Elias called Paula. Paula listened while he described the pacing, the early arrivals, the uneaten food, her attention toward the ridge. Could be territory, she said. Could be prey moving. Could be she's hearing another animal. Another bobcat? Maybe. Maybe a coyote. Maybe something we won't know. Elias looked out the window. The bowl sat upside down on the porch rail, frost clinging to its rim like sugar. She seems unsettled, he said. That may be good, Paula replied gently. Unsettled means she's still wild enough to answer the world beyond your porch. Knowing did not make it easy. That evening, Adam came by with the repaired headphones and a paper bag of cookies from his mother. Is the visitor still coming? Adam asked. Sometimes. My mom said I shouldn't tell kids at school. Your mom is wise. I only told my grandpa. Elias lifted an eyebrow. He mostly just goes to the diner. That covers most of town. Adam looked alarmed, then saw Elias's mouth twitch and relaxed. He placed the cookies on the porch table beside the radio. These are for you. Mom said not for bobcats. Seems to be a popular instruction. After Adam left, Elias found one cookie shaped vaguely like a star, though one point had broken off. He set it on a saucer beside his mug and thought Ruth would have praised the effort and eaten the broken one first. Maribel appeared during the weather report. She came fast, not panicked, but purposeful. Her coat was fluffed against the cold, making her seem larger, though Elias could still see the lean strength under the fur. She bypassed the bowl, stepped beneath the porch edge, and sniffed the air where Adam had stood. Then she saw the cookie. It was high on the table, beyond her reach, but the smell must have carried. She stared at it with such narrow suspicion that Elias felt obliged to explain. Not for you, he said softly. Town rules. Maribel's torn ear flicked. She turned away with great dignity and sat facing the yard as if she had never cared for foolish human stars at all. There was warmth in that little moment, and Elias held on to it. But the warmth did not last through the night. Halfway through the second song, Maribel rose suddenly. No sound had reached Elias. No shape had moved that he could see. Yet the bobcat's body changed all at once. Her shoulders lowered. Her tail went still. Her ears fixed toward the ridge with such sharp attention that the porch seemed to fall away around her. The radio sang on. Maribel took 3 steps into the yard, stopped, looked back toward the porch. It was the first time Elias had seen hesitation in her that was not fear of him. For a breath, the old man thought she might return beneath the steps and fold herself into the familiar pool of radio sound. Instead, she turned uphill, passed between the cedars, and disappeared without eating. The porch felt larger after she left. Elias remained in the rocking chair until the weather report repeated. Snow after midnight, wind before dawn. He carried the bowl inside with food still in it. He wrapped the radio cord twice around its wooden back. Then he fixed the broken porch step by lantern light, because the thought of Maribel needing shelter beneath a loose board suddenly felt unbearable. When the new board settled into place without a sound, Elias rested his hand on it. A repaired thing should have comforted him. Instead, he looked toward the ridge, where the cedars stood black against a snow-heavy sky, and wondered what call in the wild had grown louder than the radio. Snow began just after midnight, and kept falling as if the sky had forgotten how to stop. By morning, the yard had disappeared beneath a smooth white hush. Fence posts rose from it like dark knuckles. The woodpile wore soft caps on every split round. The cedars bent under the weight, their lower branches pressed close to the ground, making hidden rooms of shadow beneath them. Even the creek's voice seemed muffled, reduced to a faint ticking under ice. Elias woke before dawn because the house had gone too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, waiting quiet. He lay still for a moment beneath the quilt Ruth had stitched from old shirts, listening to the stove settle and the wind nudge loose snow from the porch roof. The radio sat on the chair beside his bed, unplugged and silent. He had brought it in after fixing the porch step, more from habit than reason, wiping the wooden case dry before setting it down. In the dim room, its dial looked like a closed eye. By 7, he had shoveled a narrow path from the porch to the shed. Each push of the shovel made a soft scrape against the new porch step. No groan came from the board now. It was firm, clean, and quiet, and that should have pleased him. Instead, the silence of it made him miss the old complaint. Ruth's warning had lived inside that sound. Maribel's suspicion had lived there too. Now the step held steady under his boots, doing its job without memory. Elias stood looking at it longer than a man needed to look at a board. The red squirrel appeared late, bursting from the shed roof in a puff of snow, and immediately regretting every choice that had led to winter. It leapt toward the fence, missed the top rail, scrambled, recovered, and sat there with its tail over its back like an offended umbrella. "You and me both," Elias murmured. The small foolishness warmed him for one breath. Then he looked toward the cedars. No tracks crossed the yard. The snow was too fresh to prove anything. That was what he told himself. Maribel might have passed before it fell heavily. She might have stayed higher on the ridge. She might have sheltered beneath rock or root, where wild creatures knew the shape of storms better than old men did. She might have done exactly what a bobcat should do, and kept away from a house in bad weather. Still, he set the metal bowl near the woodpile before dusk. He placed only a little food in it. Paula's caution stayed with him, even when worry pressed hard against his ribs. Do not make dependence. Do not crowd. Do not mistake need for permission. He repeated those words while the evening closed down blue around the house. The porch light came on early. The radio crackled harder than usual when he plugged it in. Static rolled under every station, thick and restless. Elias turned the dial slowly, searching through the noise until he found the old country station, weak but present. A man's voice broke apart, then returned. Road slick, wind chill dropping. More snow likely before morning. Elias sat in the rocking chair with Ruth's blue mug between his hands. The repaired step lay pale below him, its new wood not yet weathered gray. Adam's striped stone sat on the railing beside the radio, half hidden under a little drift of snow that had blown in sideways. Elias brushed it clear with one finger. The stone clicked lightly against the wood, and for some reason, that small sound made the porch feel less empty. Maribel did not come. The first song ended, then the second. The bowl sat untouched beside the woodpile, gathering snow along one rim. The cedar shadows deepened. Once something moved beyond the fence, and Elias leaned forward before realizing it was only a clump of snow sliding from a branch. He lowered himself back with a slow breath, embarrassed, though no one had seen him. He told himself not to turn concern into claim. A wild bobcat missing from a porch was not a lost house pet. She had a territory, a winter coat, instincts older than any radio song. She had survived before Elias knew her name. She might survive long after he stopped being part of her evenings. But the radio played into the dark, and the space beneath the steps remained empty. Near the weather report, The station cleared. A woman began to sing, low and steady, one of the psalms Maribel usually tolerated with half-closed eyes. Elias did not realize he had leaned toward the yard until his knee touched the porch rail. Snowflakes drifted through the porch light, slow and bright, and vanished when they crossed into the dark beyond it. "Come on then," he whispered, too softly to travel. Nothing answered. Only after the song ended did he stand. He carried the bowl inside because the food would freeze. He told himself he would try again tomorrow. He wrapped the cord around the radio, but did not bring it in yet. His hands moved with care, the way they did around delicate wiring, while the rest of him felt strangely hollow. Then he saw the print. It was near the porch cord, where snow had blown thin under the eaves. One paw print, rounded, soft-edged, already half-melted from the little warmth leaking from the house wall. Elias crouched slowly. The print faced the porch, not away from it. There were no clear tracks leading in or out. Wind had erased them, where fresh snow had covered them, or the Bobcat had stepped only once into the protected place before vanishing back into the storm. Elias could not tell. He stared at that single mark until his knees began to ache, and cold soaked through the seam of his glove. Maribel had come close enough to hear the radio, close enough to stand where the light touched the cord. But she had not stayed. The realization moved through him quietly at first, then settled with a weight he could not shrug off. He imagined her beneath the cedars, listening and turning away. He imagined her injured paw remembering pain on frozen ground. He imagined another sound from the ridge, pulling her toward danger or need, or some wild obligation he had no right to understand. Inside the house, the stove gave a low iron tick. Elias touched the edge of the paw print with one finger, but did not disturb it. He had learned enough by then not to take what little she left. Snow continued falling. He went inside, leaving the porch light on and the radio under the eaves, still playing low to the empty yard. That night, Elias slept badly in the chair by the kitchen window, waking each time the wind struck the cedars, each time the radio hissed through static, each time the house made a sound that was not a bobcat returning. By morning, the paw print was gone. By mid-morning, the storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the snow. The sky cleared to a hard, empty blue, and sunlight flashed off the pasture so brightly that Elias had to shade his eyes with one gloved hand. Every fence wire carried a white ridge. The cedars stood burdened and still, their branches bent low like old shoulders. When the wind moved at all, snow sifted from them in soft curtains, whispering down through the cold. Elias had already called Paula before breakfast. He tried to keep his voice steady while he told her about the single paw print under the eaves, the untouched bowl, the storm, the way Maribel had seemed pulled toward the ridge before the snow came. Paula listened without interrupting. That was one of the things he had come to trust about her. She never rushed worry into comfort. "I'm going to call Ranger Boone," she said at last. "If there are tracks, she'll know how far to follow. You don't go alone." Elias looked toward the cedars. "I can see the lower fence from here." That is not the same as knowing where ice is thin. He almost smiled because Ruth would have liked Paula. Waiting was harder in daylight. At night, the radio gave him something to do with his hands. In the morning, every small task seemed false. He washed the blue mug twice. He swept snow from the porch after already sweeping it once. He checked the repaired step and found it solid under his boot, which somehow made him feel no better at all. The metal bowl sat clean on the counter, and he kept glancing at it as if it might offer an explanation. The red squirrel appeared near the shed, leaving tiny prints like punctuation marks across the roof. It dug at a drift, found nothing, then looked toward Elias with the offended desperation of a preacher who had misplaced autumn. "You planned poorly," Elias told it. The squirrel sneezed. That one ridiculous sound loosened something in him for a moment. Ranger Callie Boone arrived a little after 11 in a green county truck with chains on the tires and snow packed around the wheel wells. She was in her early 40s, tall and narrow-faced, with kind eyes that missed very little. Elias had seen her once at the post office, helping a tourist understand why a young bear near a trailhead was not an invitation for photographs. She moved with that same calm now, stepping from the truck and taking in the porch, the woodpile, the cedars, the bowl visible through the kitchen window. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Elias is fine." Callie, then. She did not ask to hear the whole story while standing in the cold. She asked where the print had been, where Maribel usually came from, how the paw had looked, what direction she had faced the last evening Elias saw her. Her questions were practical, but not unfeeling. When Elias pointed toward the ridge, Callie looked that way for a long time. "Bobcats can cover more ground than people think," she said. "And they can disappear in places we'd swear were open." "I know," but his voice did not sound as if he knew. They began at the porch. The wind had erased almost everything near the house, but under the eaves, where the snow had blown thin, Callie crouched and studied the faint depression Elias had protected in his memory more than in snow. It was barely there now, only a softened hollow near the cord. Still, she nodded once. "Bobcat," she said. The word struck him strangely, not because he doubted it, because someone else had confirmed that Maribel had truly stood there while the storm moved around the house. She had not been grief shaping shadows. She had not been loneliness making an animal out of static. She had been there, close enough to leave one mark and far enough to vanish. They found clearer tracks near the woodpile. The snow beneath the cedars had stayed loose and sheltered, and there, between fallen needles and dark roots, small rounded prints moved toward the lower fence. The right front print was lighter than the others in places, not absent, but careful. Callie showed him without touching it. She was still favoring it some. Elias swallowed. The tracks passed under the fence where the bottom wire had lifted from a leaning post. Elias knew that gap. He had meant to repair it before deep winter. Maribel had used it more than once, he realized now, slipping between his small human property and the larger world that had always held her true address. Beyond the fence, the land dipped toward the creek. They moved slowly. Callie went first, reading the snow with the patience of someone listening to a quiet language. Elias followed in her steps when she told him to. His breath burned his throat. Snow squeaked under his boots. Once, a chickadee dropped from a branch, snatched something invisible from the bark, and vanished again, its small confidence almost cruel in such a worried morning. At the creek bottom, the tracks became harder to follow. Wind had swept through the narrow draw, lifting powder and laying it down again in pale waves. Cedar needles peppered the snow. Rabbit tracks crossed and tangled with mouse trails. Twice Callie stopped, knelt, and found a partial print where Elias saw only disturbed white. The creek itself was not fully frozen. A skin of ice covered the slow edges, but the middle still moved dark and narrow between white banks. It made a small glassy sound, clicking under the cold. Elias stood above it and remembered the way the radio had clicked in static before finding a song. He disliked the comparison as soon as it came, but it stayed. Callie followed the tracks along the bank for another 30 yards. Then they stopped, not ended cleanly, not in a way that told a story. They simply disappeared where wind, ice, and overhanging brush had worked together to erase the next sentence. There was a scuffed place near a fallen log, a scatter of snow beneath a cedar, and then nothing Elias could recognize as Maribel. Callie searched in widening arcs. Elias stayed where she told him. Though every part of him wanted to push through the brush calling a name the bobcat had never agreed to carry. He knew better. Sound could frighten a hidden animal farther. Human panic could make a bad situation worse. Love, if that was what this ache had become, had to keep its hands in its pockets. After 20 minutes, Callie stood still. "She may have gone up through the rocks," she said, pointing toward a steep cut above the creek, "or crossed farther down where the bank is easier. There's no sign she stopped here." No sign. It should have comforted him. It did not. Elias looked at the creek, at the broken lace of ice near the stones, at the cedar shadows gathered thick beyond the draw. The world had never seemed so full of places a man could not enter. Hollows under roots, gaps in stone, dark tunnels made by snow-bent branches, 100 wild rooms, each holding its own silence. He thought of the porch radio playing to the empty yard. He thought of Ruth's hand resting on the wooden case during her last winter. He thought of Maribel's torn ear tipping toward a woman's low song, and the way she had once pinned the radio cord like a snake, solemn as any hunter who had saved the house from danger. His throat tightened, but he did not cry. The cold seemed to hold even that inside him. Callie touched his sleeve lightly, not pulling, only reminding him he was not alone at the creek. "We'll keep watch," she said. "I'll check the road cuts this afternoon. Paula will let me know if anyone reports seeing her." Elias nodded. Before they turned back, he crouched near the last place he could see one partial print. He did not touch it. He only looked long enough to carry its shape with him. On the walk home, the sun slipped behind a thin cloud, and the snow lost its shine. The house appeared through the cedars with the porch light still on from the night before, pale and unnecessary in daylight. Adam's striped stone sat on the railing beside the quiet radio. The metal bowl waited in the kitchen window. Elias thanked Callie, though the words felt too small. After her truck left, he plugged the radio back in. Static filled the porch first, then, faintly, music. He set the empty bowl near the woodpile, not because he expected Maribel before dark, and not because anyone had told him it would help. He set it there because some kinds of hope were not loud enough to be called hope. They were only routines a person kept when the tracks ran out. For 3 evenings after the search, Elias kept the porch radio playing before the sun touched the ridge. He told himself it was only routine. That was the word he used, because it was smaller than hope. Routine meant checking the cord for dampness. Routine meant brushing snow from Adam's striped stone on the railing. Routine meant setting the metal bowl near the woodpile with a little food inside, though the cold stiffened it quickly and the bowl came back untouched. Routine meant sitting in the rocking chair with Ruth's blue mug between his hands, listening to the station fade in and out, while the cedars darkened one branch at a time. The first night, he stayed until his feet hurt. The second, until the stars looked sharp enough to cut. The third evening, the air softened, and a pale thaw began to loosen the snow from the porch roof. Drops fell into Ruth's old geranium bucket with slow, hollow ticks. Elias had once thought that sound annoying. Now he listened for it the way a man listened for footsteps in another room. Paula called before dusk. No reports had come in. Callie had checked the road cuts and the creek bend again. No clear sign. No bad sign either. Paula said that last part carefully, leaving room for Elias to place his worry wherever he could bear it. "Sometimes no news is all the wild gives us," she said. I know. He did know. Animals vanished. Weather covered tracks. The ridge kept its own counsel. Still, after he hung up, he stood in the kitchen with the receiver in his hand and felt old in a way that had nothing to do with years. On the porch, the radio coughed static and then cleared. A woman's voice came through, low and steady, singing one of Ruth's old favorites. Elias stepped outside before he meant to. The cold took hold of his face. The repaired steps stood quiet beneath him. Too quiet, he thought, then felt foolish for missing a broken thing. He sat down. The song carried into the yard. Snow still lay deep under the cedars, but the top had hardened and shone faintly in the porch light. Somewhere near the shed, The red squirrel made one short disgruntled sound in its sleep, as if winter had disturbed its dreams. Elias looked toward the lower fence. Nothing moved. He tried not to count the minutes. Counting made absence into a measurement. Instead, he listened to the singer's voice and let his eyes rest on the places Maribel had once been. Beside the woodpile, beneath the steps, at the edge of the cedars where her torn ear had caught the light. The yard seemed full of her and empty of her at the same time. The first song ended. Static came. Then the announcer spoke briefly about icy roads, and another song began. Elias did not know this one. It had a slow fiddle line and a soft rhythm, like a person walking tired but determined along a dark road. Halfway through it, the metal bowl shifted. The sound was small, a scrape in the snow. Elias stopped breathing. At first he saw only shadow near the woodpile. Then the shadow separated from the stacked fur and became shoulders, ears, a short tail held low. Maribel stood with snow clinging to the fur along her legs. Her coat looked rougher than before, and one side of her face was dusted white, where she must have pushed through a drift. The torn left ear was there. The pale bent whiskers were there. Her right paw touched down carefully, but it touched down. She was alive. Elias did not stand. Everything in him rose toward her, but his body stayed in the chair. He lowered his eyes, then lifted them only enough to keep her in the edge of his sight. Maribel sniffed the bowl. She did not eat. Instead, she turned her head toward the radio. The fiddle line trembled through the cold air, thin and brave. Maribel took one step closer to the porch, then another. She stopped near the repaired step, stared at the new board, and seemed to consider this betrayal of familiar architecture with tired disappointment. Elias almost laughed, but the sound would not leave his throat. "It's safer now," he whispered. Her torn ear flicked. She did not flee. That single restraint nearly undid him. Maribel came no farther than the bottom step. She sat there, not beneath it, not hidden in her usual place, but beside the new board, with her body angled toward the cedars and her face turned toward the radio. Snow melted slowly from her whiskers. Her eyes were half open, not with sleep, but with exhaustion held at bay by caution. She smelled of cold, wet fur, cedar, and the outside world. Elias noticed a burr caught against her chest. He noticed a pine needle stuck across one eyebrow, giving her the stern look of someone judging a church supper. He noticed a dead leaf in the fur of her shoulder, and when it slid loose and fell, she startled, then looked offended that the leaf had behaved so poorly. The warmth of those tiny things hurt. They proved she was real. Not memory, not wish, not a shape made by loneliness and snowlight. The song went on. Elias's eyes burned, but he kept his face still. He understood that this return was not an ending. It did not make the creek harmless or the storm untrue. It did not make Maribel his. It did not promise tomorrow. It only meant she had crossed back through whatever wild rooms had hidden her and stopped, once more, where the porch radio played. After a long while, she bent and took one piece from the bowl. She chewed slowly. Then she lowered herself to the snow beside the step, paws tucked, ears turning weakly toward every sound. Elias reached, not toward her, but toward the radio. The volume had begun to fade under static. He turned the knob barely a breath, just enough to bring the music forward. Maribel's eyes opened wider for a moment. Then they eased again. The old man sat through the rest of the song without moving. When it ended, Maribel remained. Only then did Elias let out the breath he had been holding since the bowl scraped in the snow. It left him almost silently and vanished into the cold between them. Maribel stayed beside the repaired step until the porch light went pale with frost. She did not sleep in the easy way of a house animal. Even exhausted, she remained partly awake. Her torn left ear turning toward the trees, toward the gutter, toward the small clicks inside the radio whenever static crossed the psalm. Her body had folded low against the snow, but her wildness stayed upright inside her. Elias could see it in the way her eyes opened at every shift of wind. He sat with her until his hands went stiff around Ruth's blue mug. The bowl was nearly empty by then. Maribel had eaten slowly, one piece at a time, pausing between each, as if remembering whether food could be trusted. Twice she looked toward the creek. Once she stood, tested her right paw, and lowered herself again, with a care that made Elias press his thumb hard against the mug handle. At dawn, he called Paula. He spoke from the kitchen window, keeping his voice low, though the Bobcat could not have understood the words. Paula asked about breathing, movement, appetite, alertness. Elias answered as plainly as he could. Yes, she had eaten. Yes, she was moving. Yes, the paw looked tender again. No, she had not tried to come inside. No, he had not approached. Good, Paula said. Keep doing less than you want to do. That instruction followed him through the morning. Doing less was harder than repairing something complicated. Elias wanted boards, blankets, tools, answers. He wanted to build a wall against the storm and place Maribel behind it. Instead, he did what Paula advised. He cleared snow from beneath the porch without going near the place Maribel rested. He opened the side of the old woodshed so she could choose shelter if she wished. He placed dry straw in one back corner, not too deep, not boxed in, with two open ways out. He moved the food bowl only as far as the woodpile and kept the portions small. He did not touch her. He did not call her closer. He did not let the warm ache in his chest become a cage. Maribel watched every improvement with suspicion. When Elias carried straw from the shed, she lifted her head and narrowed her eyes as if he had brought an argument into her yard. When he backed away, she rose stiffly, approached the straw corner, sniffed once, and sneezed so sharply that the red squirrel fled halfway up a cedar for no clear reason. Elias stood by the porch rail with both hands in his pockets and looked at the sky until the smile left his mouth. The squirrel returned later, indignant and fluffy, and sat on the fence post, facing away from everyone. "You've been through a lot," Elias told it softly. The squirrel refused to forgive him. By noon, Callie Boone stopped by to check the lower fence and the creek trail. She did not come close to Maribel. She stood beside the pickup with binoculars, studied the bobcat from a distance, and nodded once. "Thin, tired, but present," she said. "That's good? That's something." Elias had learned that wildlife people spoke carefully because the world did not always reward certainty. Paula arrived near 3 with a canvas bag, gloves, and a quiet way of moving that made even the porch boards seem less likely to creak. She watched Maribel from the driveway, never stepping into the Bobcat's escape path. Maribel stood beneath the cedar branches, body low, ears flat enough to show she had strong opinions about visitors. "She remembers the trap," Paula murmured, though no trap had been set here. "Maybe people," Elias said. "Maybe." Paula did not force an exam. She said Maribel was too mobile and too stressed for that, unless the injury worsened. She checked the paw from a distance with binoculars, asked Elias to describe changes, and left him with instructions for the next few days. Food only as support, water unfrozen, radio if it kept the pattern calm, space always, no gathering neighbors, no photographs, no trying to turn a wild return into a town story. Elias was grateful for every rule. Rules gave shape to worry. After Paula left, Mrs. Vale came only as far as the mailbox. She had heard from Callie that Elias might need groceries and brought a paper sack with bread, eggs, coffee, and a small jar of peach preserves. She did not ask to see the bobcat. She simply set the sack on the post, lifted one hand toward the porch, and drove away slowly. Inside the sack was a note for the repairman, still not for the cat. Elias read it twice. That evening, the porch seemed to breathe again. The storm had cleaned the air, leaving the sky clear and glass blue over the ridge. Snow along the fence turned lavender as the sun lowered. The radio played softly beneath the eaves, its wooden case dry, Adam's striped stone resting beside it like a tiny promise. Elias sat in the rocking chair with the blue mug, and for the first time since Maribel's disappearance, he did not lean forward every few seconds to search the trees. Maribel came from the woodshed. She had not slept there fully, Elias suspected, but she had tested it. Straw clung to the fur along one side of her body, giving her the untidy look of a creature who would deny ever needing comfort. A single piece stuck above her torn ear. She sat near the woodpile and shook herself. The straw over her ear stayed. Elias looked down at his mug. Ruth would have laughed until she had to wipe her eyes. The radio shifted into a weather report, then a slow song. Maribel listened with her head angled toward the porch. But she did not settle beneath the steps. Instead, she remained halfway between the woodshed and the cedars, exactly where she could choose either shelter or darkness. Elias understood. Healing did not mean staying close. It meant having enough strength to choose distance again. That thought hurt him and comforted him in the same breath. He had spent months thinking the porch radio had kept Ruth near, but maybe it had also taught him how to let presence come and go without clutching at it. A song could fill the room and then end. A bird could take seed and fly. A bobcat could listen under a porch light and still belong to the ridge. Maribel lowered herself into the snow. Her eyes eased half shut. When static crossed the music, she opened them, gave the radio a stern look, and flicked the straw from her ear at last. Elias smiled into the steam of his coffee. He did not know what the next days would bring. More snow, perhaps. Better tracks. Another absence. Another return. But that evening, the bowl was clean. The woodshed stood open. The radio played low, and the wild creature who had crossed back through the storm was resting where she could leave whenever she chose. So Elias stayed still. He let the music be enough. Winter did not leave all at once. It loosened. First, the snow along the south fence thinned until brown grass showed through in tired patches. Then the creek found its voice again, not loudly at first, only a soft under-ice murmur that grew each day until Elias could hear it from the porch when the wind rested. By March, the cedars no longer carried snow on their shoulders, and the yard smelled of thawing earth, wet bark, and the faint sharp greenness of things considering return. Maribel came less often. That was what healing looked like, Paula reminded him. Elias accepted it, because acceptance had become another kind of work. He still set the radio beneath the eaves at dusk. He still kept the metal bowl clean, though he used it sparingly now, and many nights he left it empty. He still sat with Ruth's blue mug, warming his palms. But he no longer expected the bobcat to appear each evening. Some nights she did. Some nights only the creek listened. Some nights the radio played to moths, wind, and the rent squirrel, who had survived winter with the inflated pride of a creature who believed spring had been arranged in its honor. When Maribel came, she looked stronger. Her coat had begun to shed in small, uneven patches, giving her shoulders a rough, untidy shape. Her right paw no longer troubled her except on cold mornings or slick ground. The torn left ear remained, as did the pale bent whiskers that made her face familiar, even when she stood half-hidden in brush. She had become more herself with every week of distance. That pleased Elias. It also left the porch emptier. He did not resent it. He only noticed. By early April, the The first ferns had uncurling heads near the cedar roots, tight green spirals pushing through old needles. Robins hunted in the pasture. Mrs. Vale brought a lemon cake and pretended it was because she had made too much, though Elias knew there was no such thing in her kitchen. Adam came by with another broken radio, this one painted bright red, and asked whether the visitor still liked music. "She likes choosing when to hear it," Elias said. Adam nodded gravely. "That sounds fair." The red radio startled Maribel so deeply that evening that Elias carried it back inside after one look at her expression. She stood by the woodpile, ears flattened, staring at the thing as if it had committed a crime against the natural order. "All right," Elias said softly, too loud even when silent. He repaired it in the kitchen and returned to Ruth's old wooden radio before dark. A week later, Maribel stopped coming altogether. For 12 evenings, Elias saw no flash of amber eyes, no torn ear beneath the cedars, no rounded print near the woodpile. The bowl stayed dry. The porch stayed undisturbed. He reminded himself that April was busy for wild things. Territory changed. Prey moved. Dens mattered. The world beyond the fence had claims older than his loneliness. Still, he listened harder. On the 13th evening, a soft rain fell. It was not winter rain. It had no cruelty in it. It smelled of soil and leaf mold and the first shy grass. The porch roof ticked gently. The repaired step darkened with damp. Ruth's old geranium bucket caught water under the gutter with a hollow, patient sound that had become part of the porch's music. Elias had just turned the radio low when he saw movement in the ferns. Not one shape. Maribel stood at the edge of the cedars, thinner than before, but steady, her torn ear tipped toward the porch. Behind her, half concealed by fern fronds and wet grass, 2 small bobcat kittens crouched close to the ground. Elias became very still. The kittens were no bigger than barn cats, but wildness already lived in the way they held themselves. Their coats were softer and lighter than Maribel's, spotted faintly, with oversized paws and short fuzzy tails. One had a darker stripe down its nose. The other had ears that seemed too large for its head, and a habit of ducking behind its sibling whenever the radio crackled. Maribel did not bring them forward. She did not present them. She did not ask Elias to admire them. She simply stood where the ferns met the yard and watched him with a look so steady that he understood the rules before he moved a finger. No approach, no sound, no extra food placed foolishly close. No human excitement spilling into a wild mother's careful evening. He lowered his eyes. His heart beat hard enough to make the mug tremble slightly in his hands. The darker-nosed kitten stepped on a wet fern and startled when it sprang back upright. It hopped sideways, then looked offended by the plant. The other kitten, emboldened by this failure, pounced on a cedar twig and missed it completely. Maribel turned her head just enough to notice both disasters without appearing impressed. Elias pressed his lips together. The porch had held sorrow, static, snow, and waiting. It had held the quiet return of a wounded animal through a storm. Now it held 2 clumsy young lives discovering that ferns moved, twigs escaped, and the world was full of suspicious things. The radio shifted into a soft song. At the sound, Maribel's posture changed by the smallest degree. Not relaxed, never careless, but familiar. She sat beneath the cedar boughs, body angled so the kittens remained behind her, and turned her torn ear toward the music. One looked at the radio. The other looked at Elias. Elias looked at his mug. He knew, with a sudden ache, that Ruth would have loved this without trying to keep it. She would have stood behind the kitchen curtain and whispered too many names, then crossed most of them out because wild babies did not need human naming. She would have made Elias promise not to tell half the town, then failed to tell no one herself. A small laugh moved through him, silent and warm. Maribel heard something in his breath. Her eyes lifted. Elias stilled again. After a moment, she blinked once, slowly, toward the porch. Then she rose and guided the kittens away, with no sound Elias could hear. Not a call, not a command. Only a shift of her body, a turn of her shoulder, a language made of movement and attention. The kittens followed, though the twig pouncer had to be reminded by Maribel's tail brushing its face as she passed. Within seconds, the ferns closed behind them. The yard was empty again, but not the same kind of empty. Elias sat until the rain softened into mist and the song ended. Then he carried the blue mug inside, leaving the radio to play under the eaves a little longer. Not as a lure, not as a claim, but as a familiar sound in a world where a wild mother had chosen, for one brief spring evening, to let her young hear what had once helped her survive. By May, the porch no longer felt like a place waiting for winter to end. It had become part of spring. Rain washed the last gray dust from the boards. New grass rose in bright, uneven patches around the woodpile. The cedars put out tender green tips that smelled sharp and clean when the sun warmed them. Beneath the railing, where snow had once drifted against the steps, tiny purple flowers appeared without permission, their stems so delicate that Elias stepped around them as carefully as he once stepped around Maribel's muddy paw print. He had rebuilt more than the broken step by then. One board had led to another. That was how repairs often went. A man lifted what was loose and found what had been quietly failing beneath it. Elias replaced the lower riser, tightened the railing, sanded a splintered edge near Ruth's old chair, and added a narrow shelf beneath the eaves for the radio, high enough to stay dry and low enough for the sound to carry into the yard. Adam helped him one Saturday morning, mostly by handing over nails before Elias asked, and asking questions he was trying very hard not to ask. "So, the Bobcats can still hear it?" the boy said at last. Elias kept his eyes on the screw he was setting. "The radio was never for trapping them here." "I know. It just plays." Adam nodded. "Like the creek." Elias looked at him then, surprised by the rightness of it. Exactly like that. They placed Adam's striped stone on the new shelf beside the radio. It looked small there, gray with its white line running through it. But Elias liked the sight of it. A boy's quiet offering. A repaired porch. Ruth's radio. Nothing grand. Nothing claimed. Just small things staying where kindness had left them. Maribel came 2 evenings later and noticed every change. She emerged from the ferns with the 2 kittens behind her, though they were less hidden now and more reckless than any creature their size had a right to be. The darker-nosed one pounced at beetles, fern tips, shadows, and once at its own tail, then seemed personally betrayed when the tail followed. The larger-eared kitten approached the new step with great seriousness, sniffed it, and sneezed. Maribel stood still at the edge of the yard. Her torn left ear leaned toward the porch shelf. Her pale bent whiskers caught the low sunlight. She looked at the repaired railing, the radio in its new place, the stone beside it, and Elias sitting motionless in the rocking chair, with Ruth's blue mug in his hands. Then she walked to the bottom step and pressed her cheek once against the new wood. It was quick, practical, a Bobcat scent mark, not a thank you. Still, Elias had to lower his eyes because his chest tightened in a way that left him no room for breath. The kittens, having observed this important ceremony, immediately tried to climb the side of the step and failed in 2 different directions. Elias looked toward the pasture until his smile settled. After that, the evenings became less dramatic and more precious. Maribel did not come every night. Sometimes a week passed with no sign of her, except a track in soft mud near the lower fence, or a tuft of pale fur caught on a cedar twig. Sometimes she appeared at dusk with the kittens tumbling behind her, and sometimes alone, lean and silent, stopping only long enough to listen through one song before vanishing toward the creek. The kittens grew bold, but not tame. Elias made sure of that. He no longer left food unless Paula advised it during hard weather or after a stretch of poor hunting. The bulls spent most days on a hook in the shed, clean and unused. When Mrs. Vale asked whether the little family needed anything, Elias told her the same thing Paula had told him. They need distance more than they need us. Mrs. Vale accepted this with a sigh and brought muffins anyway. For the repairman, her note said. Obviously not for spotted trespassers. One muffin had a bite missing from the corner when Elias opened the paper bag. He blamed Mrs. Vale. Later, he found the red squirrel on the porch rail, with crumbs on its whiskers and the smug expression of a criminal protected by lack of evidence. "You're a burden to honest society," Elias told it. The squirrel continued chewing. On warm evenings, the porch filled with small sounds. The radio murmured beneath the eaves. The creek ran full beyond the lower pasture. Insects stitched the grass with thin humming threads. The kittens rustled through ferns, stopping whenever Maribel stopped, moving whenever her tail shifted. Elias learned not to laugh when they made mistakes. Laughter sent them backward into cover. Instead, he let his warmth remain quiet, tucked behind his mug. He watched them discover the yard the way all young wild things discovered a world that was both wonder and warning. The darker-nosed kitten learned that moths near the porch light were harder to catch than they looked. The larger-eared one developed a fierce dislike for the geranium bucket under the gutter and swatted at its reflection whenever rainwater collected inside. Once, both kittens froze at the sound of the radio announcer coughing, then hid behind Maribel as if a mountain lion had spoken from inside the wooden box. Maribel, to her credit, looked only mildly ashamed of them. Elias never spoke when they were close. He saved his voice for after they left, when the yard had gone still, and he could tell Ruth softly what she had missed and somehow not missed at all. He would say that the kittens were getting longer in the leg, that Maribel had looked strong tonight, that Adam's shelf had held through rain, that Mrs. Vale was still pretending not to care. Those conversations no longer broke him. They had become part of the house's gentler rhythm. Grief had not vanished. Elias understood by then that it never really did. It changed rooms. It changed chairs. It sat sometimes in the blue mug, sometimes in the old radio's static, sometimes in the sight of a wild mother turning away with her young, because the dark beyond the fence was where they belonged. But the grief had softened around the edges. It no longer asked him to remain frozen in the life he had lost. It allowed him to repair a porch, teach a boy patience, accept muffins, laugh at a squirrel, and sit still enough for wildness to pass near without being frightened by need. One evening near the end of May, Maribel came alone. The sky was gold behind the ridge, and the whole yard smelled of warm cedar and damp earth. Elias sat with the radio playing a song Ruth had once loved, his hand resting lightly beside Adam's stone. Maribel stopped below the porch shelf, lifted her face toward the music, and listened. No injury bent her now. No storm clung to her coat. Her torn ear and pale whiskers remained, but they had become marks of survival rather than worry. After one song, she turned toward the cedars. At the tree line, she looked back once. Elias did not raise his hand. He did not call her name. He only nodded, and Maribel slipped into the green dark as freely as she had come. Years later, Elias Mercer would sometimes forget the exact date Maribel first appeared beneath the cedar trees. He knew it had been late October. He knew there had been rain on the porch rail and wood smoke lying low over the pasture. He knew Ruth's old radio had been playing through static, and he knew his coffee had gone cold in the chipped blue mug before he realized he was no longer alone. But the calendar day slipped away from him. The feeling did not. It stayed in the house the way cedar scent stayed in a wool coat. It lived in the repaired porch step, now weathered gray to match the others. It lived in Adam's striped stone, still resting beside the radio on the narrow shelf beneath the eaves. It lived in the metal bowl hanging clean and mostly unused in the shed, a reminder of the season when care had meant doing less than his heart wanted. Elias had grown older in the quiet way men did when no one was measuring them every morning. His beard had gone whiter. His hands had stiffened, especially before rain. He no longer took apart 3 radios in a single afternoon, but neighbors still brought him small broken things, and he still listened before he touched a wire. Adam grew tall enough to look him in the eye and eventually left for school in Bozeman, though he came back on holidays with radios from thrift shops and stories he pretended were not homesickness. Mrs. Vale kept bringing preserves and cakes for the repairman, never for any spotted trespasser, even after the spotted trespassers had mostly moved deeper into the ridge country. The red squirrel remained, impossibly, insultingly alive. It grew rounder every year and developed the habit of sitting on the porch rail during weather reports, as if judging whether humans had finally learned anything useful about clouds. Elias once found it with its head inside an empty paper muffin wrapper, and when he cleared his throat, the squirrel backed out slowly with crumbs on its face and no visible regret. "You outlived your manners," Elias told it. The squirrel flicked its tail and continued. Maribel did not become a porch animal. That mattered. She never moved into the shed. She never allowed touch. She never brought her kittens close enough for human hands, and Elias never tried. The little family used the lower fence gap, the creek bend, the fern bank, and the cedar shadows according to needs Elias could only guess at. Some seasons he saw them often. Some seasons he saw only signs, a print in mud, a tuft of tawny fur caught on bark, a half-second flash of a short tail vanishing through tall grass. The kittens grew into young bobcats with their mother's silence and none of their mother's patience for radio static. The darker-nosed one passed through the yard one August evening, long-legged and lean, pausing only to glare at the geranium bucket, as if remembering an old family enemy. The larger-eared one appeared once during a spring rain, listened to half a song from the ferns, then left before the announcer could cough. Maribel came alone more often as the years folded on. Sometimes she appeared at dusk with no warning, older but still strong, her torn left ear sharp against the cedar gloom, her pale bent whiskers silvered by age or moonlight. She would sit at the edge of the yard, not beneath the steps anymore, but near enough for the radio to reach her. Elias would lower the volume slightly, because age had made him gentler with sound, and together they would listen. He never knew what the music meant to her. Perhaps it was only a pattern that had once arrived with food, shelter, and an old man who did not chase her. Perhaps it was simply familiar in a world where familiar things could be rare. Or perhaps, in some wild way no human language could hold, the low songs and weather reports had become part of the safe edge of her territory, like the creek's voice, the cedar roots, the hollow tick of water in Ruth's old bucket. Elias stopped needing to understand. That was one of the gifts Maribel gave him without knowing. Ruth had always told him that not every mystery required fixing. He had smiled at that when she was alive and misunderstood it completely. After her death, he had tried to repair silence with habit, grief with routine, loneliness with the steady crackle of an old wooden radio. Then a wounded bobcat had stood in his yard and listened. She had taught him that some broken places did not close. They became openings. They let sound pass through. They let weather in. They let a man notice a paw print, a fern bending, a small wild mother guiding her young through dusk. On one late autumn evening, nearly 7 years after the first night, frost returned early. Elias carried the blue mug to the porch with both hands. The radio was already playing softly, though the station wandered more than it once had. The repaired step held firm beneath his boot. Adam's stone caught the last pale light. The cedars stood dark and still beyond the woodpile. For a while, no one came. Elias sat anyway. The psalm changed. A woman's voice rose through the static, low and worn and steady. At the edge of the ferns, something moved. Maribel stepped into view. She looked thinner than she had that spring, slower too. But her eyes remained amber and clear. The torn left ear tipped toward the radio. The pale whiskers curved unevenly from her muzzle. She stood under the cedar shadows for a long moment, looking not at Elias exactly, but at the porch, the shelf, the old radio, the place where music had once met her fear and not harmed her. Then she lowered herself into the grass. Elias did not speak. He only placed his hand on the wooden case of the radio, the way he once had when Ruth lay listening beside him. The song played to its end. Maribel stayed. And when the last note faded into the cold, Elias understood that some love never asked to be held. Some love only asked for a safe sound in the dark, a little distance, and the grace to come and go as the wild required. The porch grew darker after that, but not lonely. The radio kept playing beneath the eaves, carrying its soft thread of music past the repaired step, past Adam's striped stone, past the place where the metal bowl had once marked a careful beginning. The cedars received the sound without answering. The creek moved below the pasture in its own patient language. Somewhere beyond the fence, the ridge held its wild rooms, its hidden paths, its watchful eyes. Elias remained in the rocking chair until the stars came through. He did not know whether Maribel would appear again tomorrow, or next week, or only in the small signs the earth sometimes left for those patient enough to notice. But he no longer feared the space between visits. The bond had never belonged to a schedule. It had lived in restraint, in memory, in the old kindness of letting a wild creature remain wild. The blue mug cooled in his hands. The porch light hummed. Far out, near the ferns, Maribel's shape slowly became part of the dark, her torn ear the last thing visible before even that disappeared. The music stayed a little longer, then softened under static, as if the night itself were turning down the volume. And perhaps that was where the story rested best. Not with a cage, not with a farewell, only with an old man on a Montana porch, a radio playing low, and a bobcat somewhere beyond the cedars, carrying a remembered song into the wild. Thank you for staying with Elias and Maribel tonight. May your own heart remember the gentle creatures that changed it, and may your room grow quiet in a peaceful way now. Sleep well. The porch light was still glowing when the last note faded into the trees. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.